Okay, well, thanks very much for invitation to come speak here and for the kind introduction, Seffi. It's been a pleasure to be able to spend a few days at the Technion, which having the opportunity to meet a whole bunch of colleagues whose work I follow on a regular basis, and to find out what's been going on here. It's a very, very impressive place, lots of exciting work. So what I wanted to talk about today was some of the issues at this interface between the computational world and the online social world, and to think about these designed online social systems, and to think about what we can learn from large traces of them. And this idea that we're sort of exploring new territory, right? This idea that we go online and we look at online social networks and we see something new, or we see something familiar but in a new light. This is something I think which has excited the field, for roughly the past 2 decades, ever since people began putting things on the internet. And you see, even sort of early in the evolution of this area, exuberant statements like Jim Gray's in 1998 that the emergence of cyberspace and the World Wide Web is like the discovery of a new continent. This feeling that we're discovering something new. This idea of the online world as a phenomena that has to be studied on its own terms. And it's sort of that sense in which there's something kind of two-edged about the way in which we think about these online social systems, right? So on the one hand, if you think about them as just information systems to be designed or computer systems to be designed, then you'll in general be surprised by the way they sort of rebound against your efforts at design, because in the end there are human beings behind them, and human beings who respond to incentives, who respond to particular kinds of social phenomena, who have certain cognitive biases, who have certain ways they communicate and interact. And if you don't design with those things in mind, then the system goes off in directions that you didn't expect, right? It seems to not do what you wanted. And so you end up actually having to think about these social principles as part of the design space. And I think that's sort of an important point, right? It's not so much that I think the field of computing went out and it woke up one day and decided, let's work on sociological problems. It's that those problems really got forced onto the field of computing by the systems that they were trying to build, right? By things like, beginning with the web and search, but also, with systems like Wikipedia, like Facebook, like Twitter, and all of these companies. On the other hand, if you go online and you sort of say, this is a great opportunity to look at human beings in their sort of natural habitat, we're going to study things at this very large scale, which is a very appealing feature of these problems, right? That we're going to be able to look at the behavior of hundreds of millions of people at this minute-by-minute resolution. But if you view that as a purely organic activity, then you'll be surprised in the opposite direction, right? By the fact that if you take a site like Facebook, and you sort of step around behind it, you'll find that there are all these knobs and dials that you have to turn, right? What is it exactly that you're seeing on Facebook that's being controlled by algorithms, just as, of course, web search is being controlled by algorithms, just as your experience when you shop online is being controlled by algorithms. And so there are a lot of computational decisions being made in all of these settings, even settings where you sort of feel like you're seeing sort of the raw, pure, unfiltered experience of social interaction. And so it's sort of in that balance, right? Systems that have this organic and this naturalistic human component, but that are still being designed. And that's sort of the place where I'd like to explore. And so I wanted to tell you about a sort of sequence of things that I've been doing jointly with two colleagues, my student Johan Ugander, who's graduating this year, and Lars Backstrom, a former PhD student of mine who's now the director of newsfeed ranking and infrastructure at Facebook. So actually, to the extent that when you walk around to the backside of Facebook and see all those knobs and dials, it's sort of Lars and his team that's there turning those knobs and dials. Okay, so some joint work with them, and in particular about the role that graphs play in all of this, right? So if I think about the terrain of the online world, it's partly social, partly geographic, but it certainly is partly graph theoretic. And in some sense, in the battle for kind of mental mind share, or whatever you want to call it, graphs have been doing very, very well. And so to the extent that where once it was really a sort of controversial modeling decision to model social interaction using graphs, now if I teach an undergrad class about the web, I almost don't have to explain what all these dots and lines are, right? So that political polarization now has this kind of new visualization in the way, at least this was before the 2004 US presidential election, all of these bloggers on the left and all of these bloggers on the right were all talking about the same event, a presidential election, and the ones on the left were all talking to each other, the ones on the right were all talking to each other, and we had this very natural partition in the graph. And so this kind of conceptual notion of polarization that we have in our minds gets this very concrete mathematical realization in the way the graph really has these two pieces to it. Similarly, if you want to think about political mobilization, the way protest movements might evolve, for example, you can again see that as this kind of process that branches out through a social network. And for example, the picture on the right comes from some joint work I did with David Libben-Nowell, where we actually traced the spread of a chain letter that was involved in some protest activity. Each person who signed it was latching onto the person just before them, and so this branching tree spread out through the entire network. And again, you know, the sort of picture we have of the word getting out, the word going viral, all of this becomes this very concrete tree-like structure. So graphs are at the heart of a lot of things that we're thinking about. And you know, maybe one thing that these two pictures suggest is that you know, there's a mixture of trying to learn new things and also what you might call the shock of the familiar. That we're taking things that we sort of understand intuitively, but we're seeing them in different ways and we're analyzing them computationally. And that's in effect what these algorithms online have to do, right? They're these immensely powerful things that can discover very, very subtle patterns at very large scales, but they have no particular domain knowledge. They don't know anything about the world, and so they're really trying to induce this from the data. And in that tension, right, between sort of these immensely powerful things and complete lack of domain knowledge, I'm actually reminded of a lecture I went to about 20 years ago on the Cornell campus, a lecture by Carl Sagan, one of Cornell's famous exports to the world. Carl Sagan's lecture was entitled, "Is There Life on Earth?" So Carl Sagan was a much beloved figure at Cornell in the early 90s, although we didn't actually see much of him because he traveled a lot and appeared on TV and things. So, you know, Carl Sagan sightings were always sort of talked about, and so when he was giving a lecture on campus, you showed up to listen to it. But this was certainly an unusual title. It was actually a phrase that Nature had put on the cover of an issue which one of his papers appeared. The paper had an only slightly less weird title, "A Search for Life on Earth from the Galileo Spacecraft." And the reason I mention this is because he was sort of asking a question that I found myself coming back to, which is, what can you learn from raw data? Or in his metaphor, what would a Martian scientist learn from the emissions that were coming off of the surface of the Earth? I mean, very much the kind of question that you ask when you think about an algorithm, right? It's almost like this sort of all-powerful Martian sidekick that you have that's able to process huge amounts of data but knows nothing about the world, right? What would it see? What would it think? In Carl Sagan's case, the data being looked at was not digital online data. It was actually physical emissions coming off the Earth. So here's what had happened to set up his lecture in this article. The Galileo spacecraft was being sent out to the outer solar system to do one of these exobiology experiments, look for evidence of life on the moons of Jupiter or Saturn. And in order to get out there, it did one of these things that I guess they often have to do, which is it sort of did the slingshot through the inner solar system. So it wrapped around Mercury or Venus and then headed back out. And in heading back out to the outer solar system, it actually flew over the Earth and had this whole battery of measurements all ready to go. And it picked up a whole bunch of stuff from the Earth and it went out. And so Carl Sagan's question was, you know, if we're going to detect subtle signals of the evidence for maybe life on the moons of Jupiter or Saturn, we should at the very least, as a kind of control experiment, be able to detect that there is life on Earth. Because, you know, that would be kind of reassuring, you know, that we were able to do that. And so he spent the next hour saying, you know, imagine that we are Martian scientists and we have just gotten all these readings from this planet. And we'd like to know, is there anything interesting going on here? What do we detect in the data? And so, you know, he spent the next hour talking about the things you might detect. And as I recall, one of the big issues was actually the sort of this kind of coexistence of oxygen and methane, since diatomic oxygen tends not to exist very long near methane without combusting. And so the fact they're both there meant something very unusual was going on. And there were other things you might pick up. So, you know, I heard that lecture. It was a striking image, you know, this idea. But it's only recently I've begun sort of, you know, the last 4 or 5 years begun thinking really about this, because this is how I think about these algorithms, right? We're looking at things that we sort of are all around us, this kind of social environment we're in. But we're analyzing it using these tools that are very powerful and, in a sense, know nothing. And so I actually wanted to put up 2 pictures that I used on Tuesday night when I was speaking earlier here on campus to sort of show the kinds of raw data that these systems are seeing. And the first is kind of a life on Earth picture, right? It was a question that Dave Crandall, Lars Backstrom, Dan Huttenlocher, and I asked, if you could put a dot on a map for every photo that was uploaded on the internet, right? Every time you take a photo, right, your camera might have a GPS, or you might use a map interface. Your cell phone might locate it. So there's a latitude and longitude of that photo. Right? So I take a big black screen and I put a white dot at the exact latitude and longitude of every photo that got uploaded. We did this in 2009, so this was on Flickr, which was a big photo sharing site that was quite dominant at that time. And so the question is, what sort of shapes appear when you can think about Facebook photo uploads in the same way. And you put all those dots on a big black screen, and you end up with shapes like this. And so this is one of the pictures I included on Tuesday night when I was talking. And you immediately see all sorts of things about the world that kind of stand out here, especially if you sort of know what you're looking for, right? So this is effectively a map of coverage of all these photo uploads. And I'll point out a few things actually in this talk for future reference. We'll try using some of these mental heuristics, right? So if we knew nothing and just wanted to sort of notice some things, so we'd notice obviously there's some density here, and there's some particular bright patches, where particular population density happens. The photos go up to certain points and then they stop, because it's much harder to take photos out in the middle of the ocean than it is in the middle of France or Spain and so forth. So we see this population density. We also notice that when you see an empty region, you should ask, is it because people can't live there? Or is it simply that people don't live there? Or actually in the case of Flickr, the fact that Flickr users don't live there, right? There are actually lots of people here and here. They're just not using Flickr. So we're not seeing them on the map, right? So this difference between Flickr users can't live here, they just don't live here, right? Two different things. Also, when we see these kind of one-dimensional contours, sometimes they're coastlines, right? There's brightness going on. Sometimes they're they're rivers or they're mountain ranges, right? These one-dimensional threads that run through the data. And when you see a one-dimensional thread running through the data, there's something there that people are following. You just don't know what it is, right? Or maybe you do know what it is. OK, so let's sort of remember all these mental heuristics. This is exactly the way a Martian with lots of data might look at something that it does not fully understand. But what I'd like to do is do this with networks, right? I would like to take social networks and ask the same sorts of questions. How do we take what's there and try to analyze it? And in particular, this question, take a network like Facebook. How do we discover the fine structure of a billion-node network? Now, there are a couple reasons you might want to do this. One might be because you're helping, you're someone like Lars who's actually, playing a key role in running a site like Facebook. And so you actually need this in order to figure out what is the content you should show to people, how to prioritize what they're seeing, and so forth. And I'll come back to that question, right? All of these knobs and dials that are going on behind what looks like an organic social experience. And the other is we might actually want to learn, deeper things about the social structure of the world. And this is an amazing data resource for asking those kinds of questions. So how should we look at this? Well, one thing we could do is splash it onto a map, right? Sort of reassured by our success at sort of mapping out the Eastern Hemisphere from, social media, we could take the social connections on Facebook and put everyone at their home latitude, longitude, hometown, whatever, and then have these. And this is certainly an interesting picture. And you also see population density and things. But it seems to sort of miss the whole point that we really want to understand the network, not the geography. And the problem with the network is that a 1 billion node network, right? And this is Facebook. So people have typically, 100 or 200 friends on Facebook. So a billion node graph with a local degree of 100 or 200, this is a structure which in any real sense is kind of incomprehensible to us as human beings. We really can't understand structures like that. And so the question is, what do you do when you have an incredibly messy mathematical object and you don't know how to talk about it globally? Well, one useful thing often with structures like that is to localize, to talk about, pick points on the surface and talk about the neighborhood of points. Right? And one does this in a lot of mathematical modeling activities. And let's actually try that here, right? Let's take individual points, or each individual point in the Facebook graph, and look locally in the neighborhood of it. So actually, what I wanted to draw next was the second of the two pictures I wanted to show from Tuesday night, which is let's take one node in the graph, draw all of their friends, all this person's friends, and draw a link between every pair of their friends who are friends with each other. Okay? So in other words, in mathematical shorthand, it's the induced subgraph on their set of friends. Okay? If you did that, this is the picture you get, and screen resolution seems good enough to do that. I mean, it's one person's network. So there's actually a Facebook engineer who actually kindly volunteered to donate their network to science so that we could study it. And these are all their friends. And again, links between every pair who are friends. And so again, you know, let's kind of engage in our little mapping heuristic from the picture of the Earth. We could also do some mapping here, right? We see these regions of great density. So this is one part of his life, clearly, with lots of interconnections there. This is another part of his life, lots of interconnections there. Smaller, you know, groups, one of these, you know, so these are actually his coworkers at Facebook, as it turns out. These are his friends from college. He was an alumnus of Cornell. Family is somewhere in here, right? These different parts of his social life. And actually, almost all of our networks look just like this, right? So having paged through a few hundreds or thousands of these at this point, there's, at a course level, there's really less variability in this than you might think. We all have the different parts of our social life that we inhabit. They're all internally dense, and most of them don't interact very much. And so that's sort of some mileage that you can start to get on what these graphs look like. And so this was, this was the proposal that we had, which, and again, it was my student, Johan Ugander, who I think really sort of crystallized this into a sentence, which is, rather than think of Facebook as a billion-node network, which ultimately is a sort of enticing but perhaps useless activity, let's instead think of it as a billion distinct networks, small networks that all overlap, right? Facebook is a billion of those, right? You have one and I have one and each of these. And what do we know about them? They're small, 100 to 200 nodes, right? So they're a scale we can think about. And they're relatively dense, right? So all the things we know about, you know, graphs that actually have high internal edge density become useful here all of a sudden, because that's what these graphs look like. Okay. Now, so now we have to ask a different question. Not what do I do with a huge graph, but how do I map a collection of a billion graphs? Someone just handed me a collection of a billion graphs in the form of Facebook. I'd like to characterize what it looks like. You know, ideally, you know, wouldn't it be nice if I could put sort of a simple coordinate system on them? Because of course, at the scale of 100 nodes, basically no two of these graphs at their fine structure really look so similar. It's only coarsely that I can appreciate that they sort of, you know, globally look sort of the same. So let's think about that question, this graph. And let's also ask the question, what should we have expected to see here? Right? It's useful if we're going to start talking about these structures to ask what's the sort of baseline, what's the kind of default assumption for what graphs like this should look like. So probably a good starting point for thinking about a comparison, you know, a mathematical model that we could compare to this, would be this graph model that's alternately called GNP, or the Erdős-Renyi graph model. And it's sort of the simplest thing that you might do if someone told you, create a graph on n nodes at random. What would you do? Well, you might put down n nodes. And then for each pair of those nodes, you might flip a coin with probability p. And if it comes up heads, you put an edge. Tails, you don't. Right? So at some level, that is kind of a very simple way to do a random graph. N nodes, each edge present with probability p. I have to watch out for all these wires here. OK. Now, this is actually an extremely rich model in graph theory. And it's, you know, been used in a number of domains, right? It's been used to study phase transitions. It's been used in combinatorial existence proofs. On the other hand, it's not actually a great model of social networks. And I'm not trying to blame either Erdős or Renyi, since they didn't make it up for that reason. But it is sort of a useful baseline. So let's kind of document two problems that the GNP model has so that we can understand how other networks deviate from them. One is that GNP does not produce nodes with an enormous number of neighbors, right? Because if every node in here has n-1 neighbors, and each one is a neighbor with potential neighbors, each one is a neighbor with probability p, then you're going to have something which is very concentrated around its average. That's more a problem for thinking about this as a model for, say, the web graph. Because on the web graph, you have sites, you know, Amazon, Google, things with huge numbers of neighbors, which, you know, wouldn't be explained by this. Less of a problem for social networks. Because if we're talking about actual friendships, or even actual online friendships, then somehow the cognitive limits we have on maintaining social ties mean, you know, none of us can actually claim to have 1 million genuine friends, right? You know, you could be a celebrity on Twitter, you could have 1 million followers, but that's not the kind of social network we're talking about. We're talking about actual friend links. There's a second problem that GNP has, and that one is an actual problem for what we're trying to model, and that is that real social networks are rich in triangles. And triangles are sort of an important thing, one of the most important things you can think about it as a structure when you think about social networks. And the reason, right, so triangles just means 3 people who all mutually know each other. Why are social networks so rich in triangles? Well, sociologists argue it's due to this process that they call triadic closure, which is that triangles tend to close, right? So if I take this graph and I sort of watch it for a little while, you know, over time something might happen, like this edge might appear. right? And this edge might appear for a few reasons, right? For example, maybe this person who knew both of them introduced these two people. Or maybe these two people, realizing they knew someone in common, just went out and met each other. Or maybe the fact that these two people knew this person was a symptom of the fact they all belonged to a group together and they were destined to meet. There are a lot of reasons why triangles might close in social networks. In fact, all of those reasons are active. So, you know, when you run it for a little longer, I mean, like, these two people, surely this edge has to form. I mean, they have all these friends in common, you know, and you run time forward, maybe eventually this edge will close also. Right? Triangles close. So that means that real social networks ought to be sort of richer in triangles than, for example, GNP would suggest. So that's something that we should take into account. And maybe we could ask, you know, is this the only deviation, or are there more subtle deviations between this model and what we see? OK. So in order to ask that question, let's go back to this idea. I have 1 billion graphs. Is there some kind of global way to describe what they all look like together? And so here's a plan. And so this will involve a technique that's actually been used in a variety of areas, which is to try describing each graph, each neighborhood graph, by a short vector of its subgraph frequencies. So I'll walk you through what I mean by this. So let's pick some small value of k. And if you want to just think k equals 3, right? Take 3 nodes at a time. Now, there are 4 possible graphs on 3 nodes. Here are all of them. The empty graph, the one with 1 edge, 2 edges, or 3 edges. 4 possible graphs on 3 nodes. And so every time I pick 3 nodes, 3 friends of this person, it forms one of those 3 possible graphs. Right? So I take these 3 nodes. I say, OK, which of these 3 people are friends with each other? Just that one. So these 3 nodes form that pattern. They contribute to x2 because they form that pattern. So what I could do is just run over the entire, all possible sets of 3 nodes in this graph. And for each one, it forms a pattern, which I add to that counter. And if I did that over everything, I would have the fraction of all 3 tuples that form the empty graph, maybe that's 18%, that form this graph, that's 37%. They contributed to that, 14% and 31%. So I've boiled this big, complicated, messy graph down to a vector with 4 numbers. Actually, if you think about it, it's a 3-dimensional vector because these numbers have to add up to 1. So one number here is redundant. If you tell me 3 of them, I know what the 4th one is. OK, so that's this idea of subgraph frequencies. Take big graph, boil it down to short vector that describes something about the global, you know, that sort of through local means tries to characterize global structure. And k doesn't have to be 3. For example, if I took k equals 4, there are actually 11 different graphs on 4 nodes. There's no reason at all that you should know that. And here they are. We had no idea until we went and looked it up or did trial and error or something. But OK, and here they are. And I could do that. I could go through all 4 tuples, and I could create a big, that's now a 10-dimensional vector, 11 numbers add up to 1. So this is a technique that's been used in many, many different domains. So in sociology, this was called the triad census, because you're going around taking a census of how many 3 tuples form each pattern. In computational biology, it was used very, very successfully in this notion of network motifs.
Who calls these graphlets.
Yeah.
She also looks at the specific role that each node in a match plays, and you can learn a lot from this alone. Yeah.
So it's extremely rich areas.
Illustrations are called graphlets.
Yeah.
And when you go up to n equals or k equals 5, there are 74 of them.
Yes. No, you also go out to 5, absolutely. So so this is exactly the technology that we wanted to try using, and effectively drawing on this work in applied math, computational biology, sociology, pure mathematics, where it's called subgraph homomorphisms. So it's sort of a lot of areas flow together around this. And so the question is, what would it look like if we try it in characterizing neighborhoods, right? How might we apply it here? So what should we do? So we could boil each of these neighborhoods down to one of these things. And we could try to plot this in some sort of a space. So how would we do that? So these axes, right? So I have, on this axis will be the frequency of empty graphs. This is the frequency of triangles. This is the frequency of one-edge graphs. And I'm omitting the wedge, just because I get to omit one of the numbers. They all add up to 1. OK, so let's put a dot for each graph that exists on Facebook. Actually, we collected a sample of a few 100,000 because after a while, the space gets filled in. You don't really need all 1 billion of them. OK, so we're going to put each one as a dot on a map. And we're going to sort of do the same thing we did with the map of the Earth, right? One dot in each position. And what is the shape that we begin to, do we begin to see shapes? And so if you put all these together, you actually get this sort of a shape. Now, let's actually, right, so now this is a 2D picture, and unfortunately I didn't create a beautiful revolving cube display of this. But if we were to look at this, it's actually sort of serpentine. It kind of comes up and then actually curves toward the back of the cube. Okay, so it's a sort of serpentine shape. Okay, now let's try to sort of use the heuristics we had when we did this on the surface of the Earth, right? So surface of the Earth, we had a bunch of photos, we had a bunch of dots, and we said when you see coastlines, you should ask why they're there, right? So first, there's clearly a region of density. And in fact, we see something interesting, right? So remember on the surface of the Earth, there were empty spaces where people couldn't live and other empty spaces where people simply didn't live. And you see that in graph space also. Right? So the upper half here is in fact something which is excluded for purely mathematical reasons, which is if I try to write down a graph in which more than 3/4 of all the 3 tuples form this shape, it's actually not possible. Right? There's a sort of interesting combinatorial theorem to be proved there from the theory of subgraph homomorphisms that this maxes out at 3/4. And so this region's empty. The fact that region's empty says nothing about people. It's a fact about graphs. On the other hand, this lower corner here towards 0 is a region which would have to have lots of wedges. And that doesn't get anywhere near the combinatorial bound. It becomes empty much faster because basically people don't live here. There are graphs here. It's just no social networks actually look like them. Okay? So this is actually sort of a rich area of extremal graph theory, and one can tap into the literature on this to figure out what the actual possible combinatorial bounds on this are, as Ron is pointing out. And in fact, even understanding what the feasible region of triangles is, right, in this space of graphlets, that's something which only people have begin mapping out, right? So Razborov in 2007 did some beautiful and extremely hard work in this space to work out some parts of this boundary of where everyone could live. But in fact, that's a hard open problem. But what this is showing is that actually only a fraction of that space is actually populated by real human networks. The other parts are empty because that's just not how networks are organized. Now, there's a final question that we asked in our picture of the Earth, so let's ask it here, which is when you see a one-dimensional thread through the data, you should ask yourself, what is the river or the mountain range or the highway that runs through that? Why is everyone hugging that thing? And in this case, the river that runs through our data is quite close to GNP. So what does that mean? So remember, GNP was put down n nodes, attach each pair independently with probability p. Okay, now if you think about it, so n here isn't important because we're just doing fractions, so everything's normalized by n, by a function of n. So all that really matters here is p. And p is this one-dimensional parameter which I can vary. Right? So when p equals 1, every edge is present with probability 1, and I have a completely connected graph, a clique. When p is 0, no edges are present, right? So p equals 1 is here, everything's a triangle. P equals 0 is here, no edges are present, that's the empty graph. And everywhere in between is some kind of graph, which we could actually compute quite easily. What is the expected density of triangles? Well, a triangle is present, the 3 edges have to be there. So that's with probability p times p times p is p cubed. Right? What's the chance of, say, this thing? These 2 edges have to not be there. That's 1 minus p squared times p, and there are 3 ways to do that. So 3p, 1 minus p squared. And so there's a little function of p for each of my 4 numbers. It's actually this parametric cubic curve through space as a function of p. And it does what parametric cubic curves do, which is it kind of goes and then sort of twists in this serpentine way toward the back. And it's exactly sort of approximating this gigantic cloud of points, though not completely. So a couple things to notice here, right? One is this is exactly the organic nature by which these social networks produce structure. Because it's not that everyone got together and decided, let's produce something which looks sort of like GNP. Each of us just went about and went on and haphazardly formed friendships, and our friends formed friendships with each other, and we introduced people, people met each other. But in aggregate, we end up with a shape that sort of has this, rich structure. And the other is, of course, it's not really GNP. It's deviating, and actually in a fairly systematic way, right? Because what it's doing is the point cloud is moving away from the curve in the direction of more triangles. It's filling in more triangles, and it's getting denser in that direction. And so that is sort of the big deviation that we have here. Now, we asked the question, is that really the main source of deviation in this picture, or is something else going on? And could we augment the GNP model to try putting in this tendency to close triangles, right? So not just, add triangles, haphazardly, but to really ask the question, could we model the process of triadic closure by which triangles form? So let me show you 2 slides of math about that, just a model that we've been exploring, which leads to a bunch of interesting open questions. Okay, so here's the idea how you might add triangle formation to GNP. Okay, so the idea, and again, this was Johan, my student who comes from a more continuous math background than I do, naturally sort of thought of this as a continuous time process. Imagine I put down n nodes, but where Erdős and Renyi, because they were discrete mathematicians, flipped coins all at once and put down edges, let's instead run time continuously and imagine the edges evolving. So what I'll picture is that I'm going to create a Poisson process on each pair of nodes, which effectively means I'm going to put these alarm clocks, one on each pair of nodes. Okay? The alarm clock is set to go off after a probabilistically measured amount of time, exponentially distributed. And so 2 empty nodes, the alarm clock goes off at rate gamma. And when it goes off, an edge forms. And on nodes where there is an edge, there's an alarm clock with a time delta. And when the alarm clock goes off probabilistically, the edge goes away. Okay, so edges come, edges go. Now, if I just did these 2 things, I would have actually basically produced a very complicated way of describing the Erdős-Renyi graph. Right? Edges would be appearing, edges would be disappearing. But in the steady state of that process, edges are there with some ambient probability p independently, and that's the Erdős-Renyi model. Okay, now we want to sort of make this a little richer, so we're going to add one final set of alarm clocks. So on every triple of nodes where 2 of the edges are present but not the third, whenever I see that pattern, I'll put down a final alarm clock of rate lambda. And when that alarm, and so again, an exponentially distributed process with parameter lambda. And when that clock rings, the edge forms. Now, social networks have no natural triangle destruction process, so we're not actually going to model the going away of the edge. Basically, we wanted edges to be created and destroyed independently, and this extra boost for triangles as people introduce each other. Okay, so that's the thing. And we could take small subgraphs, right? So remember that space of 11 different graphs on 4 nodes, and we can actually build all the state transitions on this. Okay, and this is the continuous time Markov chain now. So from anywhere you are, right, so if we're here, for example, then with rate gamma, this last edge forms. With rate delta, one of these edges goes away, and so forth. Okay. Now, when we played with this model, it actually shows a number of interesting things. One, actually, that I won't really have time to go into is it actually shows the rarity of a particular structure that you see with incredibly low frequency in social networks, which is the square. Right? If I take 4 nodes in a social network, and I ask what are the edges among them, you very, very rarely see a square shape. Right? By a square, I mean those 4 edges are present, but crucially, these 2 are not present. Right? And actually, although I am low on time for anecdotes, I'll tell one here. That while I was working on this paper, I was actually walking through College Town in Ithaca with a colleague who I knew, and we passed 2 people. And I said hi to the one on the left, and he said hi to the one on the right. And we had a discussion about how I didn't know the one on the right, he didn't know the one on the left. I was like, gee, that's weird. You don't see that very often, that you pass 2 people and I knew the one on the... And we probably had to walk another half block, even though I was actually working on this paper, to realize it's the square. And even in everyday life, it's weird when you encounter a square. And this continuous time Markov chain actually tells us something, I think, useful about why is the square so unusual. Because really, if I think of these as reaction rates, then the square is exactly the analog of essentially sort of an unstable molecule that's only seen for short periods of time in chemical reactions. Because first you have to get to the square, which means you have to get here, and then rather than close one of these appealing triangles that wants to form, you have to form this edge, which doesn't want to form. Right? So in the kind of stoichiometric picture of these networks forming, you have to get to here. And once you get to here, this has a very fast breakdown time, because these 2 triangles still want to form, and you end up at one of these things. Right? Hard to build, and it goes away quickly. Okay, so we learned a bunch of things about networks from this kind of picture, but this is actually an interesting process, we think, to try analyzing, and we certainly don't understand everything about it. However, we now have a model with basically 2 parameters. One is the ratio of those 2 numbers, because one of those sets a basic time rate, and the other one, the other one just is the free parameter, and a second free parameter. The question is, with these 2 free parameters, can we match the kind of subgraph frequencies we see? So on 3 nodes, there are only 4 frequencies. That's kind of easy to match. But it turns out even with the 11 node subgraph frequencies and those 2 parameters, one can actually come quite close to matching the very bumpy distribution that one has of all 4 node subgraphs that one sees on Facebook. Right, so this is, in orange is the actual neighborhood graph. In black is the optimum fit to the model. And the maximum likelihood fit to the model also comes with an estimated parameter value, right? That the rate of triangle closure is roughly 20 times the rate of spontaneous edge formation, right? And at the best fit, that's the number you're seeing. It's not a perfect fit. And as we try to push it into fit just right, things kind of morph out of existence. There's the square, which is so rare. The model wants to also think of stars as rare, right? So it too thinks, well, here too there are all these appealing triangles. Yet, in fact, social networks are more rich in stars. So it says there are other things we're not capturing in this model. And it does give us a hint that it's not just triadic closure. There's other stuff that's being unmodeled here. OK, so that's the model I want to talk about. And there are a number of, I think, interesting open questions about what are the global structural properties that one gets out of this. It seems quite different from a bunch of other formalisms like the exponential random graph framework and other things. But I wanted to move on to some applications that we've been looking at with subgraph frequencies, and in particular with these neighborhood networks. And in particular, this question that we started from. So the question we started from was, we have this network neighborhood, right? Remember the person with all their friends, all the connections among them. And what we'd like to do is think about, for an application like Newsfeed, which Lars manages, how do you prioritize the content coming from all those friends, right? Because in the end, you have your 100 to 200 friends produce in total, if you're an active Facebook user, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 pieces of content per day. If I count all of the posts, the photo shares, the link shares, the song listens, the events you checked into, all of it put together is a lot of stuff. And that's like maybe 10 times the size of even an active inbox in one's email, so you're not going to read all of that. You want to know what should be filtered, what should be shown to you, what 40 to 50 things are the most important, most relevant, most engaging to you. And so for that, we need some kind of understanding of what are your relationships to all these people. And that led us to the following question from the graph, which is, given a person's neighborhood, can we identify their most significant social ties? OK, so that's the question we asked. We're given a node like V. Now I'm drawing it in cartoon form. And I'd like to look at, there are the clusters in their life and so forth. I'd like to figure out who here seems particularly significant in a structural sense. Now here too, theories from sociology tell us that triangles play an important role, right? So the theory of weak ties, due to Mark Granovetter from the early 70s, says that one very, very strong signal for a close friendship is what you call embeddedness, right? So there's an edge E here, say between V and some node. And I'll say the embeddedness of E is the number of triangles that contain it. Or equivalently and more intuitively, it's the number of mutual friends shared by their endpoints. Right? So this picture here, here's an edge VW. They have V and W have 4 mutual friends. And there's sort of this sense from sociology that high embeddedness means close friendship. Right? The more mutual friends you have, the more likely this is to be a close friendship, or as sociologists call it, a strong tie rather than a weak tie. OK.
Did anyone measure the clustering coefficient of these graphs?
The network neighborhood graphs or the?
Yes.
I think I'll get to that point. Yeah. So save that question, which I think will get answered in the later slides. So exactly, I have these set of neighbors, and that's now embeddedness is sort of so kind of central to the whole notion of tie strength and close friendships that in some sense when you look at it in the sociology literature, the two are often sort of said interchangeably, right? Embeddedness, mutual friends on the one hand, and how strong the friendship is on the other hand. So that suggested to us that if we're trying to prioritize neighbors in the network, we could try ranking friends by embeddedness. Just take all the friends you have and sort them by how many mutual friends you have and say, OK, that might be a way to sort of rank the closest friends. Now, if you try that, you sort of actually see what the problem is. Say I tried that on this guy that we were looking at before. Well, if I try it on this guy we were looking at before, embeddedness is going to actually find a lot of nodes up here, all these coworkers, right? And probably among these coworkers are indeed maybe some close friends. But they're not all his closest friends. The point is, if you work at a company and say you have 40 friends at that company and they're all on Facebook, and many of them are friending each other just because you friend everyone at your company, then many of these people have an embeddedness of, say, 30, even though they're not all the closest friends of this person. Whereas, you know, here in the family cluster, there's also a lot of interconnection, but there are just fewer family members on the internet, and so there's just less embeddedness. So in some sense, there's a currency conversion problem here, right? Which is that sort of the units in which embeddedness is measured here don't seem to be the same as the ones in which embeddedness is measured here. That's sort of a problem. Now, we stared at pictures like this, as I said, for quite a while. And you know, there were sort of these striking pictures, and you get lots of intuition from them. But sort of like any sort of aesthetically compelling thing, you know, you go back to it over time, and every time you look at it, you see something new that you hadn't seen before. And eventually we started going back to this thing and looking and noticing something that in retrospect was so obvious that we should have seen it from the beginning, and maybe all of you saw it right away, which is this node here. This node here sort of stands out because it's not in either of the big clusters. In fact, it's explicitly in this spring embedding of the graph far away from the big clusters. But it radiates out into a lot of different parts of the network. A little bit here, a lot to all of these things. Right? That node somehow seems special. You sort of wonder, you know, maybe we should also think about, you know, who that node is and how we might find it. Okay. So, and that's actually the point. Up there is the coworkers. Here's the college alumni friends. This person is actually the wife of the Facebook engineer. That's their wife in the graph. And so we thought, it jumps out at us. It clearly is a very, very strong social tie this person has, which lives outside the clusters. Maybe that's actually how we should focus our question, right? The sort of fuzzy question of how do we find good techniques to find the important people in your life, which is a very hard thing to evaluate. How do we know if we're succeeding? In the spirit in which computer science, I think, often makes up sort of concrete challenge problems and then sees how it can do on them, we made up a challenge problem for ourselves. It's very precise. It's just not inherently necessarily a mathematical question. But here was the very precise question that Lars and I made up. Given a Facebook user who reports their relationship partner on the site, take their neighborhood graph as the input. Right? So your input is a graph G, just like in all the algorithms problems it looks at. Input's a graph G. Output is you're allowed to guess one node, and the one node should be their relationship partner or their spouse. Okay? Right? So people who say in a relationship or say engaged or say married, you should be able to name. Right? So I give you one guess. And these are people with 100, 50, 100, 200 friends. So blind guessing is going to be at best, if you have 50 friends, 2%. Okay. And that was the problem. Again, on the one hand, very concrete, because the input's a graph G and the output is this known node. And we'll hide the answer. But it's not clear exactly what techniques are useful or even how to formalize this question. Okay, so that's what we did. And here was the idea that we thought about, and this gets back to Ron's question about should we try looking at some clustering coefficient measures here. It helps a lot to say, don't just count the mutual friends, but actually look at the structure on those mutual friends. Okay, so let's actually ask, here V and W, here also is a different V and W. They both have an embeddedness of 4. They both have 4 mutual friends. So to the kind of standard sociological measures, these two friendships are equivalently strong. But notice something different. Here the 4 friends all know each other. And here the 4 friends are dispersed. Right? And on the right, that's interesting. Right? On the left, it's clear maybe they're coworkers, and those are their 4 coworker friends who all know each other also. But on the right, this means V and W know each other, and somehow their friendship can't be easily explained by any one social context. Because they know this person who doesn't know that person who doesn't know these 2 people. Right? So somehow V and W share a bunch of social circles partially. And that somehow seems important. It's in a way something that also was latent in this work on weak ties, starting with Mark Grenvetter, continuing through to Ron Burt, Duncan Watts, and others. This idea of bridging or brokerage, right? Which ordinarily was applied at the level of people, right? That one person could be a bridge between different worlds. And what's sort of intriguing to us here is that we're talking about the edge being a bridge between different worlds, right? V and W are somehow the only links between these different parts of the social world. Okay, so let's try to turn that into some kind of a formal measure that we could actually apply and then rank nodes by it, right? This notion of having dispersed mutual friends. So here's how I'll define dispersion. So cartoon picture, we're in a graph G. We have this edge VW. We have their friends who are sort of dispersed. As one does with sort of bridging measures in sociology, what we'll try doing is saying, what would be the distance between all these other people if you weren't there, right? So your mutual friends are either directly connected or have a 2-step path through you guys if you are there, right? So among your mutual friends, all distances are 1 or 2 in the graph when you're there, right? 1 when they're directly connected, 2 when they have to do that. But if I take out V and W, who knows what you might have to do? You have to go around them to get between them. And the extent to which you have to go around is a measure of sort of how much you were bridging that hole. Okay? So I'll say that basically the dispersion of this link is simply the sum of all pairs' distances among the mutual neighbors after taking out V and W. Okay. Now you can use a bunch of possible distance functions here. I don't want straight graph theoretic distance because I don't want distances to become infinite. That'd be a problem for me because I don't want a sum that has infinite terms in it. So I'd rather have kind of a 0, 1 distance function. 0 means near, 1 means far. So I could, for example, say distance is 0 if you're directly connected, 1 if you're not. Or I could do that with some threshold of k. 0 if you're at most distance k after the removal, 1 otherwise. And I could do many other things. I could say 0 if you're in the same cluster after removal, 1 otherwise. I could actually go back to that picture that we stared at for so long and say, I will literally spring embed the graph and say distance is the actual distance in that spring embedding. I could do all those things. And I can also normalize, actually. I could take this dispersion, I could divide down by the number of mutual neighbors, which is actually also useful. All right, so to cut to the chase, we tried lots of stuff. All of it motivated by this notion of dispersion, but just sort of figuring out what is the right functional form here. And what tended to work was to say, look at how many people jump to distance at least 3 after deletion, and then divide by the number of mutual neighbors. Okay? So in some sense, our iconic picture for what the relationship partner structure was here's V and W. V and W should have lots of mutual friends for which there is no third party that also forms a two-step path. That's what we wanted in the end. Okay? Right? So it's this kind of 5-node configuration, except this one is actually the absence of a node. Right? V and W, they have 2 friends S and T who can go through them, but they have no third root between them. That's 2 steps. And if you have lots and lots of those pairs, that's a sign that yours is a friendship that spans many social contexts. It might be significant for us. Okay? And so now we decided to run the experiment. Let's just take that measure. Let's take a whole bunch of people on Facebook, sort their friends by that measure, and ask how often does the relationship partner rise to the top of that ranking? That was the question. Okay. Question make sense? Okay. So here's the setup. So we picked a uniform random sample of 1.3 million Facebook users. And again, because we were doing this on top of Lars's newsfeed infrastructure, we could basically piggyback this analysis on a whole bunch of stuff that they collect when they do newsfeed anyway. They should have to declare a relationship partner in their profile, which is a symmetric declaration. You can't announce you're in a relationship with someone unless they also reciprocate, as you know from Facebook. They should have between 50 and 2,000 friends to exclude kind of new users and extreme outliers. And they should be at least 20 years old, because there are certain things we know about the relationship partner field in the Facebook profile, including the fact that teenage girls often announce that they're married to their best friends. But by age at least 20 actually sort of steered clear of most of the known pitfalls with the profile data. Okay, and then we said, so we should look at a bunch of competing metrics to see how do these different measures do. So we'll look at the gold standard from sociology, which is embeddedness, number of mutual friends. We'll look at this dispersion measure that I just defined for you, right? The number of mutual friends who are dispersed when you're taken out. And then a whole bunch of activity-based metrics, right? Because we're running on top of the newsfeed infrastructure, we can look at, all sorts of activity. We can look at how much you message each other, comment, like, check into events together, so forth. And of all of those, the 2 that were actually the most effective, and so I'll just include those 2, were the number of times you're both tagged in a photo, was a good measure of closeness of friendship, and the number of times you view the other person's profile. Right? If you're constantly looking at their profile, that's also a sign of something. Okay. Rank by these measures, see how well we do. Now, I should mention that I was prepared to be happy if, because remember, everyone has at least 50 friends here. So uniform random guessing is going to give me at best a 2% success rate. And so if we were getting a 20% success rate, that's an order of magnitude improvement over the random guessing baseline. That would have been fine with me. What surprised me was how high the absolute numbers were. Okay? So I'll fill in this table gradually just to kind of walk you through the numbers, and then I'll actually wrap up just with some sort of extra variations in conclusion. So how high were the absolute numbers? Well, so embeddedness is already doing quite well, right? The person with whom you have the most mutual friends, breaking ties sort of arbitrarily, is roughly a quarter of the time your relationship partner. But with dispersion, you actually double that, right? So it's actually more than 50% of the time, given one guess, right? I give you one guess, more than half the time your one guess is right. So it's a very, very powerful way to do this. Activity-based versus structural. So photo cotags, when you rank by that, you're right about 40% of the time, profile viewing about 30% of the time. I'll point out something actually that's even sort of implicit in this first row, but it's worth calling attention to. Had we not had the right graph theoretic measure, if we had used the default graph theoretic measure, embeddedness, from social network theory, we would have actually, in a sense, reached the wrong conclusion. We would have said activity-based metrics are more powerful than structural metrics for finding relationship partners. Right? But in fact, that would have been backwards, because it's just a question of using the right graph theoretic metric. Now, obviously, as you know from working with prediction rules, it's hard to give upper bounds to say that maybe there's some very clever measure of Facebook activity that does better. There's also maybe some very clever measure of structure that does better. Right? So all I'm showing is how far one can get with what we know how to do, having tried a lot of things. There's a difference between married and in a relationship. So not surprisingly, it's easier to find the partner when they declare they're married than when they declare they're in a relationship. So with married, it actually goes up to 60% accuracy with dispersion. In a relationship, activity actually begins to win out. So photo co-tagging relationship about the same. Profile viewing actually is the best single measure for finding a thing. Right? So when you're in a relationship, you do a lot of looking at the other person's profile. Big difference between the genders. Big gender difference. So if you are male versus female, it turns out to be much easier to find the relationship partner for one gender than the other. Any guesses? How many people think male users are easier to find their relationship partner? How many people think female users are easier? Okay. I actually guessed wrong on this one when I just sort of, it's much easier for men, actually. It's about 10% easier for men, which is actually basically, right. So for male users, the spouse relationship partner really stands out. For women, it actually stands out less. I mean, still not hard to find comparatively, but stands out less. I'll explain in a second where that 10% shortfall comes from. If we combine everything with machine learning, we can do a bit better. We can basically, we throw everything into industrial strength machine learning, we get about 70%. And actually, the real difference between males and females and where some of the incorrectness goes, if you ask when the algorithm is wrong, what is it finding? And about a third of the time, 35, 40% of the time, what it's finding is a family member. Okay. And in fact, if you say correct answer equals relationship partner or family member, the gap between the genders closes basically completely. So essentially what's happening is female users, family members are confusable for spouses and relationship partners more than for male users is effectively what's happening. Okay, a whole bunch of other quick things I could show and then I want to wrap up. One is these things get better over time. So here is months since you reported the relationship on Facebook. Here's our performance metrics. The structural measure just gets better and better, right? The sort of relationship sort of burns into the structural fabric around this edge in sort of ways that seem natural. Profile viewing actually drops off forever then. And same thing with in a relationship, right? Structural measures get better and better. Profile viewing gets worse and worse. They cross at about 12 months. And then this other thing, because everybody kept asking us, so we did it. People said, you know, does this say anything about stability of relationships, breakups, and so forth? And there was this one thing we noticed, which is we noticed that take two populations, the relationships where our algorithm guessed right, and the relationships where our algorithm guessed wrong. And in the relationships where our algorithm guessed wrong, you come back 60 days later, and the couple was actually, the user was actually 50% more likely to be now reporting their status as single. Okay. So, so in some sense, when the algorithm is wrong, there was something slightly less kind of robust in the structure that's becoming. Now, this is not saying it's actually predicting breakups, because as you see from the y-axis here, you know, no one relationship is likely to break up. We're talking about a sort of 5 to 6% base rate. So it's more that there is an increased risk of it, not that there's a, you know. Okay, so not there's any, you know, not that there's an outright prediction being made here, right? The prediction is 60 days later they will still be in the relationship no matter what the structural measures say, but there's an increased risk. Okay, so a couple final reflections and then I'll end. So one thing I sort of thought back to when we were doing all this was that actually a talk that I heard Lotzi Lovas give maybe 10 years ago actually, saying, you know, in mathematics, there are a whole bunch of structure theorems for big graphs, right? So for dense graphs, we have the Semiretti regularity lemma. For surface embed, you know, for sort of sparse graphs, we have the Robertson-Seymour graph minor theorems. There are a whole bunch of things, and they all have this statement. They all make these statements like every graph sort of looks like, you know, some big pieces of constant complexity plus a constant amount of stuff that kind of defies easy classification. And I remember him saying, you know, wouldn't it be nice if we had a kind of meta principle, not a theorem, but because it's about real graphs, but a kind of meta principle about real graphs about the kind of orderly parts and the messy parts and how they all fit together. And I sort of filed that away in the back of my mind along with the Martian scientists and everything else. And, you know, sort of, I didn't really see an action item there. But I thought back to it when we started looking at these network neighborhoods, because that in effect is what some of this relationship partner detection is trying to say, I think. That basically the sort of coarse schematic picture of a node's neighborhood is that there's V at the center. And they have this constant number of lobes, you know, the coworkers, the friends from school, the family, and so forth, of constant complexity. They all look kind of GNP-like. And then sort of a constant number of extra nodes, right? The sibling, the parent, the relationship partner, and so forth, that defy easy classification into these clusters. And that's really turned out to be a very powerful way to parse these neighborhoods and to start kind of making sense of them and to try to figure out who's who and who's playing what roles in these. Okay, so just a couple slides of conclusion. This is sort of one thing you can find out by zooming into the network structure and analyzing it. It's a very interesting question to ask about structural signatures for other types of roles that people play in social networks. It's both, I think, an interesting sociological question, and it's exactly the sorts of features that Facebook is heavily trying to leverage when it's prioritizing content that you see. Right? Because again, sort of, you know, one fundamental thing that, you know, I'll try to keep driving home here is that, you know, when you see something on a social media site, it looks like it's this sort of organic, natural experience, but it's really being algorithmically managed from behind. It's being managed by leveraging features like this. And so things about, you know, leveraging it to share information, to spread information virally, all of these are things I think that are implicated in these kind of questions. Okay, and so to wrap up just with some higher order reflections here, right? These are the kinds of pictures that we're working with now, and they're coming from these very, very interesting domains, and they're telling us things both familiar and unfamiliar about what's going on in these contexts. And I think that's sort of in the end the point, right? That social networks, which have obviously been present ever since we've lived in social groups, are really being recorded at high resolution and in a form that we can actually study, we can evaluate theories, we can make up new ones. And I think a big question here is going to be, what are the right models and frameworks for reasoning about the phenomena and the structures that we see here? And of course, a question which I also asked on Tuesday night and will ask again here, you know, it's hard to talk about all this without at least invoking the question of how should we think about the dangers inherent in stockpiling all of this personal data, right? I mean, I've just described to you a whole bunch of things you can learn, in effect, whether or not the people volunteered them from the way their network was structured. And that's something I think, you know, we should all think about. And the trade-offs between the value that these kind of sites provide and the kind of, you know, ways in which we can manage them so as to mitigate the kind of potential dangers. And so I think the point is, you know, the questions of what are the right theoretical frameworks, what are the right applications, how do we reason about the benefits and risks? These are all domains in which I think there's a huge opportunity for fundamental computational and mathematical models to really inform the next steps in what we're doing here. Thanks very much.